all or most of you out there are, virtually familiar with the ANSI 5-year review cycle, which is the reaffirmation, revision, or withdrawal, to keep it simple. And I was just thinking the other day, and I was thinking, well, we're actually going through something very similar right now, where it's about time we get back to normal. And the question is what will be normal? And the old normal may be not resettable for many situations. And that therefore implies that the reaffirmation process is not going to be the process you'll go through. You'll likely go through the revision process. For some, it'll be very light, and some it'll be major changes. But coming through this whole catastrophe that we've been dealing with the last 2 years, we're faced with the opportunities. We have much improved software now for virtual meetings and for what we call hybrid meetings now to supplement the face-to-face. And we're still going to have some face-to-face. The shortness of use of the virtual meeting and hybrid meeting is that, face-to-face cannot totally be replicated yet, but they're trying to approach everything that you get in a face-to-face. And it'll be some time we may eventually get there, but it's going to be a few years, but it keeps getting closer and closer. You have now heard on the news about metaverse, and virtual reality from the gaming world. That's all coming into play and slowly working its way into the situation where we may be able to use those in the future in meetings and make them more realistic, where you'll have some glasses on and be turning around like I was talking about a decade ago and see in 3 dimensions the people next to you. You'll be able to hand a phone over and the other person virtually will be able to pick it up and operate it just like it's a real phone with their virtual. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things coming. Anyway, so there's opportunities there. And also your members' way of doing business has definitely changed. And so they're not going to be able to necessarily go back to the old way of face-to-face strictly, but it also opens up the opportunity to get more involved from the outside too. So there's pluses and minuses. So without further ado, let me introduce the moderator of the next session, Chris Dubay. He's Vice President of Codes and Standards and Chief Engineer at NFPA. And he gave us all a behind the scenes scenario of risk assessment planning for virtual meetings today, because there was a nor'easter up in his area last night and probably still going on there for all I know. And the power was out until just a little while ago. So we were scrambling, but we had a backup plan B. Wouldn't have been as good as you, Chris. I'm handing the floor over to you.
Thanks, Ed. Good afternoon, everybody. Power's on and off for me, so we have a backup to a backup plan in case things happen. And so the show will go on whether I'm here or not. I'd like to kick this off a little bit with just a very quick little bit of history here. In the past, most of us as standards development organizations considered a hybrid meeting being a face-to-face meeting with a few people dialing in via conference call or a bat phone or something. And what we're talking about today when we refer to a hybrid meeting is a meeting where we have participants in a face-to-face meeting and then another group of participants attending virtually, having what we've now come to know as remote meetings with video, data feeds, things like that, going back and forth, and how to manage those scenarios. So a couple of things that we wanted you to all hear as you go into this is that today, an all remote meeting may be working for you as a standards development organization. You may be able to get your work done, get your ANSI documents processed in a timely way, following the rules of your process. And the first thing you should walk away with is, in the near term, while we start to face these challenges, if it's working for you, you should continue to do that with confidence. You should continue to look at what is the right solutions for your organization, because this concept of a hybrid meeting is a work in progress. And many of us are learning what it means to pull this off to scale. And even for a large SDO like NFPA, we've made the decision that even through the rest of this year, our meetings are all going to be remote meetings because of some of the difficulties around hybrid meetings. But also, ANSI is looking at this as a challenge that all SDOs are facing. And so this is a beginning of a potential series of events or discussions or materials that ANSI will be looking to distribute or have you participate in to support us as members of ANSI? And so a couple things, we'd encourage you to be very active in the chat. Submit your questions. If we don't get to them all, those will all be fed into the further discussions in the future series. And again, you'll hear little snippets from each of us today, and I'd encourage you to interact with those. And we have allowed for some Q&A at the end. So to get this running, I want to indicate that we're going to have Stephanie followed by Amanda and Dan. It looked like that first slide was a little off. So I want to kick it off with Stephanie from ASHRAE. Stephanie's organization just recently held some hybrid meetings, and she's going to spend a few minutes talking about what worked and what didn't. And I'd like you to really identify what was your top win and your top fail there, Stephanie. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to the ANSI OMF for having me today. I know this is a challenge for hybrid, even though we've done the version of hybrid that Chris mentioned in his intro of just a few people remote and a lot of people in the room. And we've been doing that for quite some time, and switching to more of a hybrid where it's more split, maybe 2/3 remote, 1/3 in person, or 50-50. And we're starting to see some of that going on. We've had 2 meetings recently where we've had what we would deem hybrid meetings. One was on an international level, which was our chapter regional conference. And so from that perspective, that group did a really great job. They had a core group that was all together. And I think one of the things that made them successful is they practiced in advance, but they had all the presentations were there controlled by one group. They had them all so that you weren't having any lags and issues with connecting with that and seeing those. They were trying to allow, and probably this is where it didn't work, sharing, and they use Zoom. Zoom for the international seemed to be a much better platform, easier for everyone to use. But when they did try to allow people to share, that was kind of where they had some issues. And so that made it difficult for people to keep the meeting rolling. But with that only hiccup, that everything else went well. The connectivity had no issues, and I wasn't joining in the middle of the night. So it went well. So from that perspective, that was good. And then, and that was using a resource that wasn't like somebody's office. It was at a hotel that they were using it. So I think some others are going to talk about how they've worked with in the hotel environment. And then the other one we just recently did, ASHRAE recently moved into a new recently within the last year, moved into its renovated headquarters in Peachtree Corners. And we've got some state-of-the-art equipment in the building now that allows us to have hybrid meetings at a better, in a more successful manner than what we did in our past building. So we held our standard 90.1 committee meeting that about a week and a half ago now. The days are a blur, but a week and a half ago, and had probably about 55% remote, about maybe 45% in person at our meeting. We had a few challenges because we changed software platforms from GoToMeeting to WebEx. Due to the equipment in the building. So one of the things that made the hiccups not be noticeable in terms of audio and connecting was the fact that our team practiced. I can't emphasize when you're doing that, you're using new equipment or even doing the hybrid, you really do need to practice in advance so that you can kind of troubleshoot what could go wrong, so you're able to do that. So that prevented us from having some technical glitches with connection. So I think that was a big win. I think we found we did have some audio issues, and that was probably the fail a little bit on our part, because we had a bigger room and we realized we need a few more microphones, I think, because of the size of the room, and while we have microphones, the fancy in the ceiling, there's certain dead zones in the room. But other than that, the connectivity was really well, and we were able to engage the remote participants in the meeting, even with the use of video and things like that. But I don't want to talk for too long, because I would really love to allow for extra time for questions and answers and more discussion, because I think a lot of people have some things that really worked well and things that didn't. So I will hand it back to you, Chris.
Thank you. So next, Amanda from Amy is going to talk about, they have the luxury of having a high-end space and facility within their facility, and they've had some hybrid meetings both pre and during the pandemic, and we'd like her to share a little bit of her experience.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, and thanks to ANSI for the opportunity to share a little bit about Amy's hybrid meeting experiences with the OMF, and thanks to all of you for joining us. So I'm Amanda Benedict, Vice President of Standards at Amy. And as Chris mentioned, Amy is very fortunate to have had for the past nearly 3 years now, a dedicated meetings and conference space that is well equipped for hosting hybrid meetings. And we and our members do recognize that this is a luxury to have this, although it wasn't necessarily universally viewed that way at first by the members who were very used to having fully physical meetings. To give you all a bit of background, like many of you, Amy previously hosted our larger and/or concurrent meetings in hotel spaces. And to give you a sense of the size of these meetings, it wasn't unusual for us to have, say, 400 in-person attendees across the week of meetings and up to maybe about 200 in-person attendees packed into a theater-style ballroom for a plenary meeting or some of our larger committee meetings. And occasionally we would have a request or maybe 2 requests for ability to phone into a meeting. So we would try to MacGyver a situation or a solution that wouldn't exceed the scale of the request, but typically we didn't have a mechanism to enable effective virtual participation in these huge ballroom meetings. Now, for our very small one-off committee meetings in our older space, we would hold those in a conference room, and Amy, we'd make a best effort to enable virtual participation. We put a bunch of table mics around. Technology was spotty, so results really varied. So nonetheless, in-person participation was really the only feasible option and the norm for Amy meetings for a really long time. Meanwhile, we were getting a sense of increasing demand for virtual participation options, particularly for meetings of our international groups. And we were also looking for a way to provide better support for our meetings and to reduce the amount of resources that we were spending on securing outside or off-site meeting space and supporting it. So in late 2018, Amy moved to a new office that had a large dedicated meetings and conference space, and we were really doubly fortunate in that we were able to invest in equipping the space with exquisite state-of-the-art audiovisual capabilities and technologies, which helped to enable effective hybrid meetings and events. So all of our meetings, all of our standards meetings going forward have been hybrid. And this has been an absolute necessity to have these hybrid options. When you're in a defined space, there's a limit to the number of meeting rooms that you can open up and the number of the seats that you can have in a room. You know, it's a little different when you're in a hotel where you can just, nudge somebody, have them drag some more seats in. So since we had set an upper bound on in-person meeting capacity, we needed to promote the use of these new remote participation options. And we had to set a meeting attendance strategy that ensured that the co-chairs and leaders of the group and voting members of the group had a first opportunity to claim seats if they wanted to attend the meetings in person versus on the phone or online. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of clearly communicating to your committee members when you have a registration system, the expectations and the reasons behind using that system to register for meetings. And what we found when we went to hybrid is that there are certain segments of our committee membership that really embrace this option. They embrace the opportunity to participate remotely. So people who have conflicting meetings or have travel and they can't be in 2 places at once but still want to keep an eye on the meetings, they found that the remote option was great. They could pop in as their schedule allowed. Clinicians are another group of folks. If you've got an audit happening in your hospital, survey happening in your hospital, you can't get away from a meeting. You have to attend to that, but you still want to keep an eye on meeting proceedings. So again, you can jump onto a hybrid meeting using the virtual option as your schedule permits. Members who don't have employer funding for their travel, there can be a cost barrier if you have to attend in person. So that was helpful for them. And also those members that wanted to introduce their new employees to the standards development process without having to support costly travel, just to get their new employee there to see if maybe that was or wasn't an activity for them. So I would say there's been a bit of a, if you build it, they will come effect. Over time, we've seen increasing use of the remote option for our hybrid meetings. We went from really maxing out the in-person seats, people really vying to get those seats, to pre-pandemic, right before the pandemic, we were seeing about an equal split of people that were choosing the remote option versus the in-person option for a hybrid meeting. But even so, I would definitely say pre-pandemic that in-person attendance was still considered the norm or the gold standard. And I think we were really focused on the conversations in the room. I think, occasionally we get a bit of a voice from above effect chiming in, but we didn't do a great job of actively inviting comments from the folks that were on the phone or on the web. And I think things went on this way for about 15 or 16 months until we got to March 2020. And like many of you, we had to cancel all of our in-person events. We actually had about 2 days, 2 business days before we had a huge set of meetings that were supposed to be hybrid, and we had to cancel the in-person component and go fully virtual with those. Of course, at the time, we thought we were being overly cautious. So flash forward a year and a half, and like most of you, we've been fully virtual during that time. It has been working very well for us. We've been productive. Our groups are making progress. During that time, we have picked up some really great online or virtual meeting management techniques and approaches, and figured out some ways to get more commentary or just get a better sense of our members' perspectives on issues. So for example, we found that some folks who were infrequent contributors to a dialogue, if they were attending in person, were much more likely to put their comments in the chat during a meeting. And with in-person meetings, we wouldn't necessarily have a great mechanism for these folks to contribute in a way that's comfortable for them during a meeting. So over this past summer, we started hearing increasing demand from our committee members to resume the in-person meeting component for our September Sterilization Standards Week meetings. And this has typically been our biggest set of standards committee meetings. We hold them twice a year. And it's a very big group of members, and we wanted to accommodate the request to meet in person, but also to approach it as safely as possible, given that we're not out of the woods yet. We're not really post-pandemic, we're still in the midst of it. So we decided to go forward with it, took a look at what was going on, and decided that we could go forward with it. But we put some really strong precautions in place. So we reduced seating to allow for social distancing in the meeting rooms. We required proof of vaccination on site. People had to be prepared to show proof of vaccination. The honor system doesn't work. And we also required masking in common areas and in the meeting rooms, except while eating or drinking. And all of this was very clearly and repeatedly communicated to committee members throughout the notification of the meetings coming out, throughout the registration process. We did not want for there to be any surprises. So I'd say what went well, we actually couldn't have asked for a better group of folks to resume in-person meetings with. This is a group of professionals that are very focused on infection prevention. So they were very understanding of the precautions that we were taking. They understood them, and they were willing to abide by them. We had a registration process in place to make sure that we registered to the reduced capacity for seats. And we were expecting about 75 across at any given time across all the meetings that were going on concurrently. And we actually ended up a little under capacity. We were at about 60. And we had some folks that were taking a look at what was going on with the Delta variant at that time and deciding maybe a day or two before the meeting that they were going to take the virtual option. So, at first we were a little concerned that the amount of seats that we had set would not be enough for the demand, and we actually ended up being a little below what we expected. And I think the biggest positive and maybe the most unexpected outcome was that we saw really improved integration of the in-person participation and the remote participation. The larger number of attendees were remote, obviously, which helped, but we also found that we were all really attuned to some of those meeting management strategies that we had put in place, like the hand raising, use of the chat feature, and so on. And I think what was really helpful, and this is maybe a potential strategy for those of you who are considering going hybrid, was that we have co-chairs for our groups, and one co-chair typically was there in person, and they were managing the conversation in the room with Amy's staff support. And we typically had another co-chair who was remote and was very attuned to what was going on online. And that coordination between the co-chairs really helped to facilitate and coordinate the input between the remote attendees and the in-person attendees for this return to the hybrid meeting. So I think that's one great outcome that we had that we're going to be looking to retain going forward and make sure that we're really leveraging that as part of our strategy when we have a full return to hybrid meeting. So I think it was a good experience for us, this kind of a beta test and this limited return into foray into hybrid meetings. We don't at this time have any additional hybrid meetings on our calendar until January 2022. You know, fingers crossed, we're going to be in a different and better place by then. I'm sure we all want that. But you know, hopefully some of these experiences have generated some thoughts for all of you. So again, I want to thank you for your attention. And Chris, I'll turn it back over to you for the next presenter.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Our last presenter before we get to the Q&A session is Dan from ASTM. ASTM has scheduled committee weeks multiple times in 2021 and ultimately had to cancel them as variants progressed and circumstances changed. However, they just held a recent F-24 amusement ride committee in a hotel. And Dan, I would like you to share, if you can, you know, what problems did you have with rescheduling and what were the challenges you faced in dealing with a hotel and not with an on-site meeting facility?
Great, Chris. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. Again, Dan Smith with ASTM International. Amanda and Stephanie, your presentations were great, and they really coincide with a lot of what I've certainly learned as well. So I will not reiterate some of the main points that you made, but yeah, it was when we were preparing for this panel, I told everyone that I thought the timing of this was perfect because we just had our first, what I would call like a significant in-person meeting since the pandemic started last week. And we had the meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it was at the Albuquerque Marriott, which is like a mid-size hotel, I would say. And our committee, this amusement ride committee, gets typically like 300 to 350 in-person attendees. And this week we had about 180 that participated, and then we had about another 150 that participated in some capacity online. So I thought it was going to be, you know, just really great pilot. We've been itching to get back to really kind of experience this new hybrid model where you've got like 50% on the phone and 50% in person, because it's just so much different than, you know, the 95% in person, 5% on the phone model. So it's just so much to learn. So it's great to hear everyone's thoughts on this. You know, Chris, you mentioned just about having the meeting. You know, first, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about how we decided to have this meeting. We felt that we needed to, as ASTM staff, not just sort of make, like in 2020, I think it was very apparent to everyone, you canceled the meetings and you went on to transition to virtual, and that completely made sense. But as we started working in different industries and working with our members, we were finding, you know, the appetite for getting back in the face-to-face environment kind of was turning over a little bit. So we found it really important to survey our members, you know, work with the leaders of our members to see what their feelings were, what their comfort levels were in getting back into the face-to-face environment. And to be honest, you know, we had a conference set up in Atlanta, and I would have, you know, in August, early August, I felt really good that we were going to be having an October conference in Atlanta. And as things turned out, you know, as with the Delta variant, just as each week went by, it became more and more unlikely, to the point where so many of our members were bailing out, especially given the environment that exists in Atlanta, that it just didn't make sense for us to move on. It just, the COVID rates, the hospitalizations in Atlanta were so high that it just made everyone worry about, God forbid, when someone needs, medical attention in Atlanta, what's that going to look like? And so it became easy for us a few weeks ahead of time to just transition that Atlanta meeting to all virtual. But F24 met in Albuquerque, as I mentioned, and Albuquerque was and is very much, different than Atlanta. The COVID situation was good, not, high rates of COVID or hospitalizations, and our F24 leaders felt very confident and were very ambitious to get back to that in-person environment, recognizing that you still needed to provide that remote option. And that's, exactly what we did. So just relative to on-site in Albuquerque, the situation there for the COVID part of it was the hotel, required, like I think most of us have seen, did require that if you weren't vaccinated, you needed to wear a mask. If you were vaccinated, then it became optional. And ASTM, we really worked on the honor system. We did not enforce or check for vaccination status. So the hotel had their rules, and the expectation was to follow them. And I was a little worried, to be honest, about how that was going to turn out on site, but we were very pleasantly surprised that there were very little comments about, worries about so many people in the room not wearing masks or the social distancing part of it. That part really did not come into play. So that was a big part that I was worried about, that thankfully, at least in Albuquerque, came out, very well. In terms of the hybrid meeting setup, so, imagine our committee has 6 different meetings all happening simultaneously, and of course now all using WebEx, which is different than what we had prior to the pandemic, where maybe you've got 1 or at most 2 of the meetings using the WebEx technology, and the rest are just purely in-person meetings. And prior to the pandemic, in terms of our staffing, we would have had 1 manager who would have been responsible for visiting all the different committee meetings, and basically responsible for managing the standards process. And if there was a WebEx, need that the individual had to help out with, certainly that's part of the job as well. But when you've got 6 different meetings, all with WebEx, we decided to just send an extra person who was just responsible for floating around from meeting to meeting, making sure that, the meeting room was set right, all the equipment was there ahead of time, working with our, our leaders who would be leading the WebEx meetings off of their laptop that they, had all the assistance that they needed. And so that was a real positive. And I think that's, necessary to have at least 1 like that, where 1 person who's really strong in WebEx who can float room to room and help out as needed. In addition to on-site, we also had people back at our home office, and those folks also opened each of the WebEx meetings so that if for some reason there was going to be a problem on site with starting the meeting, then at least our folks that are in the home office could talk to the remote participants, let them know that there's a problem and that, the meeting will be starting shortly, rather than just having, all those remote attendees kind of hanging on the line on their own, wondering if, if they're in the right place or if the meeting got canceled or whatever, might be the case. So that was a real positive that I was glad we did. And thankfully everything went well. Just one logistic thing that we kind of learned that, when you look back on it from hindsight, you kind of wonder why you didn't think of this in advance. But, we had 6 meetings start at 8 a.m. and then you have 6 meetings, start right up after lunch at 1 p.m. But one of the things that we learned was it to make your life easier, if you could start 3 of the meetings at 8 a.m. and 3 of the meetings at 8:30, and then do the same sequencing after lunch where 3 starts at 1 and 3 starts at 1:30. It just, kind of lessens the the hectic nature of, making sure that you've got, 6 up and running smoothly. So that was something that we learned and that we can easily adjust for in the future, especially when we have larger conferences that have more than just 6 meeting rooms happening at the same time. In the large ballrooms that we had, we used the wireless Bluetooth speaker mic systems that worked, really great. I mean, it's a very high quality audio, and it just really worked flawlessly. Now, we didn't have those in every room, which we did receive some feedback that we should have, but we just weren't sure that we needed, that level in each of the meeting rooms, especially the smaller ones. But it did work very efficiently, and we were very pleased with that. And we'll look to replicate that in the future. Some of the attendee feedback that we received, for us, ASTM might be a little bit different than other SDOs in that when we have a meeting, not all of the attendees are eligible to vote. So for us, the polling platforms that, are on WebEx and Zoom, they really don't work for us when we want to take, what we would call an official vote. So we're looking into integrating like an out of the box, off the shelf voting tool that would integrate with ASTM's internal systems that will be able to identify voting members and then send links to those voting members. So, this would be a tool that you could use if it was an all in-person meeting, if it was only a virtual meeting, or if it was a hybrid meeting. But essentially, the important part is that all those that are eligible for a vote would receive the link and then be able to vote in real time. So for us, that's been a hurdle that we have not been able to overcome at this point, but something we want to get cracking on right away in 2022. And then overall, just, in terms of the feedback, and I think it's been, interesting to listen to Stephanie and Amanda and some of the feedback that they've received, but it's a little bit contradicting. When we've upped the game a little bit for the audio visual that we have in our hybrid meetings, our members encourage that, and they want us to even, do more. And we heard in the beginning of this about some of the possibilities for the improved audio visual and hybrid meeting technology that we'll have, in the future. But in the meantime, they're really, encouraging us to invest and spend that money to make sure that we have that best possible user experience. But we've also had others that have stood up and said they'd rather not. They would really rather not have ASTM invest in that way, in that they would rather get back to more of just that in-person environment. And the more that we make virtual participation easy and flawless, that the more likely it is that we're going to lose that face-to-face component. So I thought that was sort of an interesting, dilemma for some of us as we're trying to, wrestle with how we handle this in the future. So Chris, maybe I'll just stop there, and certainly we can move on into questions.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody. If we were around together, we'd ask for a round of applause for all of our presenters, but we're virtually, so you can all clap at home. That'd be great. Make sure you clap on mute, though. Again, thanks for all those presentations. It identifies some of the challenges, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't put questions in chat to please do that. Dan, you talked a little bit about audio, but I'd also, Stephanie, I'd ask you as well, when the OMF did the survey of their members, that was one of the biggest challenges that came out was, how do we manage the audio aspects of that? Could you kind of share what some of your best practices are? I think you mentioned practicing and how important that was, but can you get more specific on that for us?
Yeah, sure. So we've done a couple of different things. Just like I said, we were actually doing some of the hybrid. We did a few hybrids where it was more 50-50 before then. There's been a couple of things because sometimes it's a cost. I mean, as Dan said, it's an investment to do that. And not everyone has that money for the ROI for, a few meetings a year where they're hybrid or something like that. So a couple of things we've done is we have put it where you put your sound on one system. So we bought some remote microphones that you can use, not the Bluetooth like Dan, but that's a good note. I'm going to remember that. But some of the hooked to a computer itself, and the only thing running off that computer is the meeting and the sound. Nobody else is touching that, and so somebody else is a co-host and monitoring chat, and that's really cut back on the background noise, the ability to mute people. That makes it a little bit easier. Obviously, if you have the ability, in our new headquarters, we have the pass around mics. That makes a big difference, is having those mics available, but that might be cost prohibitive. Another thing we've also tried is using, like we are now in the remote world, everyone's on headphones so that they can hear that. And the biggest challenge is reminding people to, we still have that now, mute, and then muting themselves, and making sure that they have that, and then having a second person on the line, like Amanda mentioned with the co-chairs, that's monitoring that and can mute and unmute people when we're having issues. I think it's going to be a challenge. I think the bigger challenge is in the hotels, especially if you're in a city like Chicago that's union-based and they don't want you using your own equipment, because it is much cheaper. We had one group that did a hybrid, and they purchased, the chapter of our group purchased their own equipment at about $3,000 that they'll just pass year to year, because the cost at the hotel was something like 40 grand or something.
Thanks, Stephanie. Amanda, just a question for you before we get to some of the chats. You had mentioned that you have a registration process where you have a set number of people in person and then a set number of people who can attend, or maybe an unlimited number remotely. There's often been questions about a different level of experience from those who are in the room to those who are remote, and being able to participate and debate and called on as often as they should be, where if they were just raising their hand in the room, they may be easier to see. Can you talk a little bit about how Amy manages that to ensure that the committee members are getting equal level of participation, or at least a similar experience?
I think in the past, pre-pandemic, we actually were not really doing a great job at that. I mentioned that there was still kind of this gold standard orientation towards what's going on in the room. And I think what we found post-pandemic is that we're really trying to use a bit of a zipper approach to make sure that, we're keeping an eye on who's wanting to speak in the room, and having some form of hand raising there, but also hand raising online, and just keeping a watch on where the requests to speak are coming from and when, so that we can integrate those conversations.
I keep muting myself. I'm trying to follow good mute etiquette here and keep muting myself. The last question I have before we get to some of the chat ones is for you, Dan. When you think about interacting with the hotels, kind of what are your lessons learned? Like, what are the things you wish, like when you do the next one at a hotel, kind of what are the top things you're going to be asking those properties before you commit to them? What are the top things you learned?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's great. Just a couple thoughts. One is, and maybe a lot of us do this, we try and do a lot of repeat business with our hotels. Like prior to the pandemic, that's an intentional strategy that we have, just so that, when ASTM has a conference, we basically take over the entire hotel. And we're a little bit needy, I would say, maybe like all standards organizations. There's a lot that we ask for in terms of all different types of room setups, which, as you know, comes with different technology setups. So for us, the relationship with the hotel, so that they understand what our needs are going in, is really, really important. In this case that I talked about with F24 and the meeting in Albuquerque, not a hotel that we've used very often, and probably something we all need to really anticipate going forward, like with all service industries right now, is that the staffing is just not where it needs to be. So for us, we did not have a real good feel about the lack of support that we received from the hotel staff. And as a matter of fact, our person on site there felt like they were kind of on their own. So for a lot of the things that, where you needed problems for, it might take a lot longer than you would think if you needed extra audio visual, to come into the room. So I think that's a big part of it. And I'll just end, Chris, the other thing for us is, we've looked at all of our future contracts for next year and really trying to anticipate that, we're not going to get the sleeping room pickup that we thought we were going to get when we booked the meetings back before the pandemic. So renegotiating with the hotels on anticipating much less of a sleeping room block, and then also less in-person attendance, less food and beverage is really important. And what we have found so far is that the hotels are very much kind of welcoming us back with open arms, and any business that they can get is great business at this point. So it's a great time to really work with them and give them repeat business, in the future if you can, because that, obviously also helps as well.
Great. Thanks. One of the other aspects when we talk about travel that NFPA's experienced is our volunteers, the actual committee members, may have a desire to travel, but oftentimes their funding organizations aren't quite ready yet to have that desire to fund their travel. So that's one of the balances I think all of us as standards developers are going to face, is that those organizations that would normally sponsor or fund representatives have now been saving a significant amount of money on travel and entertainment expenses while the standards work still getting done. So that is that balance. And I think, Dan, you even alluded to that about some of your members are worried about that. They're worried that it'll just become a dollars and cents play versus the quality of the debate and the quality of the discussion. One of the questions that came in, there was actually a lot of back and forth in the chat, which was good, was around how do you handle voting? And Dan talked a little bit about that. But for example, NFPA, we ballot afterwards electronically to get the formal consensus position. But I'm not sure for each of your organizations if your actual meeting votes, the meetings in the room, establish consensus. If you do, could you comment on how do you balance that and how do you manage that when you have a mixed hybrid type meeting?
So I'm happy to go, Chris, on that. So the way ASTM works is we do all of our voting on the actual content of the standards prior to the meeting. So that's when the vote happens prior to the meeting. It happens all within ASTM system. And then we take the closing report, the results, all of the, what we call negatives and comments that we received on the ballot. We get them into the hands of our leaders and we post them on our website. And then the expectation is that our members are coming to the meeting and they're reviewing the negative votes that we received and they're acting on those negative votes. So what I was saying about taking votes at meetings, they're not actually taking votes on the ballots themselves. They're taking votes on whether or not they believe there's merit to the negative votes that were cast during the balloting. And, the expectation over the years has been that you leave that meeting and you've resolved all of those negative votes one way or another. So that you're leaving knowing that either the standard has been approved or it still has work, to be done. It's going to have to be reballoted. So that's, that's the challenge for us. It's not voting on the content, it's voting on the feedback. And then it's still only the voting members are allowed to actually vote, on these motions, handling the feedback. And how we logistically handle that has been the problem. We've gone as far, if you have a small amount committee, like 25 people or whatever, you can get into doing the roll call vote, but that's tedious. And if you get up into the 100, you're not going to do roll call votes. So you're probably going to be taking those votes by an electronic ballot after the meeting. So that's ASTM's world anyway.
Okay, thanks. Stephanie or Amanda, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. We have actually, it's been something we've actually been trying to get our committees to move towards and using more. We recently updated our online comment database to allow voting within the database so we can push out reports. So actually we now have the ability, we could do live voting in that atmosphere at a hybrid meeting and use that function. And we either could set it in advance of the meeting to close at the meeting. We could do motions in the meeting itself and send it out. So that's something we're going to be actually pushing more towards Like Dan, we've done ours where we actually always have a continuation letter ballot. They start the motion. You have a sense of where the numbers are, and then we do the continuation and recirculations. But the same option too would work in that as well. And we've done the tedious roll call votes of 100+ members.
So I can add to that. Amy's process is similar to what Dan described for ASTM. We don't have live votes. We might have a show of opinion in the discussion in the room. I would add, though, that one of our meeting management techniques that we've been using for several years now is that we have a roster of the committee members available. Our co-chairs know, they have access to it. They know who the members are. For our in-person attendees, we have typically used placards to designate who is a voting member versus who is an observer, so that we know who should be, commenting and who should be just observing, just attending and listening in. It's a little bit more challenging to do when you've got a hybrid meeting, but it gets back to knowing who your members are, knowing who's online, knowing who's participating.
Great, thanks. And just another aspect of hybrid meetings, I'm managing chat, text messages of questions and updates, as well as all of you on the call. So welcome to hybrid meetings. So the next question that I wanted to get to is, and I'm not sure who best to cover this, but it was a question of kind of what tools do you use to drive engagement, like to drive participation in it? For NFPA, we've been using Microsoft Teams, which seems to be a good platform, a good tool. However, a lot of people don't turn their cameras on. So you look at a bunch of blank squares, but it seems like the attendance and engagement is pretty good. For each of you, is there specific tools you found more success with than others in just driving that level of engagement? And again, I look to anyone to speak up here.
I could go first this time. I think what we've used is we've used GoToMeetings, although like I mentioned before, we're switching to WebEx, but we've actually used another way to engage people in the audience is everyone starts with their cameras off except for the chair. And then as people want to speak, they turn their cameras on, so you're better engaged in watching. And then if you're seeing that people aren't participating in discussion, that they're going to have something to say, that gives the chair the ability to say, oh, hey, Dan, I see you haven't turned your camera on. I know you have an opinion on this. And so we've been using that. And that actually helps with the bandwidth issues, because we have found once you hit about 20 cameras, then the audio starts to go downhill. So that's one of the mechanisms that we've been using.
Very simple. Yep. Go ahead,
Go ahead, Amanda, then Dan.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we've seen increased use of chat, and we've really been encouraging that. Put your comments in the chat, weigh in, let us know what you think, give us a thumbs up, something along those lines. The other thing I would add is that occasionally we use video. We have not just video on your individual computer, but we have video in our meeting room. So there have been times where we've turned on the video so the folks that are online can see what's going on in the room and get a clearer picture, in order to read the room and not just, person by person or whoever happens to be speaking at that time.
Great, Dan.
Yeah, very similar, Chris. For us, our staff, when we have our internal meetings or whatever, we have found that Teams for us kind of works the best. And then we're like a little schizophrenic. We're all over the place in terms of sometimes we use Zoom, sometimes we use WebEx. There's an Act-On, platform that we've used for trainings and things. We have found that Zoom is great for sort of like push out type events like what today is, and then using the chat just like ANSI's doing today very effectively. And then for us, it's kind of, we've been WebEx for our hybrid meetings. We've been using WebEx, and I think it's only because we're all pretty well trained and know how to use that as staff to help our members and train our members on that. But we're looking at using Zoom as well because we know it's a friendly platform.
Great. I want to actually dovetail a little bit into the platform question. There's been a couple questions around, some people call them subcommittees or task groups or breakout sessions. And with our history of face-to-face meetings, you might have a chair who would say, okay, you 5 folks who are upset about this thing and are trying to figure this out, you at the lunch break, go figure it out and come back and report. How are your organizations handling these task group meetings or breakout sessions, kind of as this hybrid meeting is moving along? So we'll go in reverse order this time. We'll start with Dan, and if you don't have anything, please pass, but I just want to give you a chance because it's a nice best practice session. Dan?
Yeah, nothing comes to mind, Chris. For us, we have sort of our like homegrown collaboration areas that we use for a lot of the task group work, where we're posting documents, and then it's an online forum in there where you can have discussions, you can chat, you can post other documents and things. And our committees have used collaboration areas to sort of go and gain positions or write pieces of documents, and then be able to kind of come back and bring them on larger sessions like we've had here with Zoom. So I'm not sure if I hit what you were looking for there, Chris, but that's an approach that we've kind of used or that we are using and we've used in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful. I don't think there's on any of these, there's a right answer. I like this. There's a lot of interaction between attendees on the chat as well here today. Really, it's just trying to attack some of their questions, but then also tee up for ANSI what are some of the challenges that we're facing. So Amanda, do you have anything to add to that about breakout sessions or task groups?
We don't typically do breakout sessions in the midst of a meeting, but as you mentioned, there will be times when we need somebody to go quickly rework something. So sometimes that's done individually, and sometimes we'll have folks, we're breaking for lunch or whatever, and they'll coordinate via email or, a lot of times they've got each other's phone numbers, they'll hop on a quick call. But we're not typically making use of our meeting software platforms, breakout rooms in the midst of an ongoing meeting. They find other ways.
Okay. Stephanie, anything to add to that?
Not so much. Most of our subgroups are meeting like outside of our main committee meetings and bringing things forward. So we haven't really had to use the breakout sessions. I think our big test will be for us when we have our next big face-to-face meeting in Las Vegas in January 2022. Cross our fingers, and we'll have a better sense of how that will work with the hybrid.
Great, thanks. And what I want to do is I want to shift a little bit. I have a couple different questions here on participation. The first one goes back to, and I got to scroll back. I love that all of you are chatting, but every question gets buried as soon as you keep chatting. There was a question around how is this impacting overall international participation? Because being the remote, having this remote option, are you seeing an increase of international participation, an increase in participation in general, more likelihood for after-hour participation? I know for NFPA, we're seeing higher numbers of attendees overall at our committee meetings because of the remote option, but I'm wondering what all of you are seeing from an international perspective specifically. You can start with Stephanie this time.
I think we've seen some more international attendance at our meetings because of this, but it depends on the start time. I think that's the biggest challenge, depending on what time zone you're in. Obviously, especially when we're dealing with the Asia countries, because otherwise they're in the middle of the night. Europe, it's fantastic. It's middle of the day most times. So we have seen, especially when we're able to schedule them, at least in the earlier morning hours, like 6 to 9 Eastern.
Amanda?
Yep.
Dan, either or.
Sure, I'll jump in. We're still seeing good participation from folks that are outside of the United States, but I think much like Stephanie mentioned, it's really dependent on time zones. So what we've tried to do is be sensitive to that and try to start and end at different times so that it's not always the same countries or same time zones that are being disadvantaged. Sometimes we'll start wee hours of the morning for US folks, and it's a much more acceptable time of day for folks in Europe or Asia. And we just try and manage it that way so that, we're not always asking the same people to be up in the middle of the night. What I will say though is that, given that there are some time zone differences, I'm not sure that we're still seeing the quality of participation from folks if the time is off for them and if they're not, on site and everybody has adjusted to that time zone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add, Chris, same, we're definitely seeing higher participation and we're seeing international participation, but I think that's hard work as well. One approach that a few of our committees have taken has been like knowingly that maybe when the meeting is actually scheduled, you're not going to get the participation from some of the international participants because of the time zones. But if you can schedule follow-up smaller group meetings, like if a few of the leaders of the committees are willing to go that extra yard because they want to make sure they're, inclusive of getting that valuable international input, they'll schedule something after hours that's more convenient for the international participants to try to draw in some of those contributions and then take them, kind of back to the committee and take it into consideration when developing the draft. So but that's hard work and that's a real commitment, from the leaders of the committees and task groups.
Okay, I'm back. So one last question, Ray, and then I actually see at least one person has their hand raised. So we'll call on someone. We'll try to unmute you and let someone else talk. That'll be interesting. We'll give that a try here today. The question actually comes from one of the NFPA standards folks that works with me. Is what is the value of having only a small number, say less than 60% or 40% even of the members in person versus a fully remote meeting where everybody's participating from the same level? Do you think that it results in better standards, or is it better to have the all one engagement strategy, say all remote, or is it worth the extra money to have a hotel cost, facility cost for a small number of people and then have a large number sitting out on that remote environment? I'm just curious of that balanced thought, how you see that mixed value.
I think that's the $1,000 question that we're gonna, figure out over the course of time. I think it's a great question. I believe that having all in person or having all virtual, one or the other, are both more efficient right now than having a half to half hybrid. But so many people are just cannot chomping at the bit, waiting to get back into a meeting environment. And, I think there's value in that just from the social part of it. And I think also there is a productivity component to it, because I think when you're, going out to dinner after hours with the folks that are actually attending the meetings, or, we've seen at the coffee break or just outside of the meeting room, things do get solved outside in that environment that don't get solved in the meeting environment. So I do think there's a lot of value in still having that face-to-face part of it. But I think we all have to kind of figure this out together and figure out, what's going to work for, and what works for one organization might not work for another. It's kind of really, I think, everyone finding their pace and finding what works best for them.
Okay. Stephanie, looks like you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say similar. That's what I noticed with our last hybrid. I think part of it is the value is the relationship building, even though it may not be your entire committee, even having that portion, it actually can help maybe get some solutions. And I think moving forward, we're going to have to look at how we can engage in those other tools for breakouts in the hybrid for those not in person. But I really do think it does help in, to get things done in a different way. But I think there's still value to it.
Okay, thanks. Amanda, anything to add to that, or you good?
No, I think Dan and Stephanie are spot on. I think there, are some thoughts that it can be more productive to gather in person. I think there is definitely value to coming together in person from a networking component, from a relationship building component. Somebody mentioned that dynamics or needs can vary from organization to organization. I'd say they vary from group to group. Some of Amy's committees are very different than some of the others, and their needs are different, and how they get the work done most effectively can vary too. I think one of the things that organizations are going to have to do is really set some criteria around what merits a face-to-face meeting or a hybrid meeting, and what can be accomplished fully virtually. I know Amy has had to put some parameters in place for, hey, this is a meeting that we can accomplish fully virtually.
Great, thanks. So a couple things I want to highlight, and then I'm going to call on Katrina Akers, who has her hand up. I'm assuming still has a question. We also, that's another issue. Hands get stuck up and never get put down, so we'll figure that out. The other thing I want to call everybody's attention to, again, we're probably not going to have time to address it today, but there is a good question that Liliana asked in chat about if any SDOs had to change their regulations or their procedures to adjust for this hybrid environment. So I'll leave that out there as a hanging question that all of us can be thinking about, but ANSI can be thinking about for the future stuff. So Michelle, do you want to free up, I think it's Katrina, was that the name? I'm sorry, the hand's gone. Maybe she put her hand down.
Yeah, yes, I could, if but her hand is down. So if I can.
Somebody raise your hand. Let's
Maybe
try
you
to raise
answered
the
her
hand.
question.
I know.
I think she just said in chat that it was an accident that she put her hand up.
Oh, Katrina, that would have been fun. So you could have owned it publicly and said it was an accident. It would have been more fun. Okay. Anything else from anybody? We're just about, I think we're supposed to finish at 3:45, I think. Is that right, Michelle? Or maybe we have
That
a
is
few
correct.
minutes. Not sure.
We
Okay.
have a few.
So I'm trying to keep us.
Yeah.
I have a few. So any last questions that we want to get to? Tim had a comment on there about some procedures that SP did. NFPA, one of the things the NFPA had to do is our end of our process is a large face-to-face meeting. We call it the tech session, which the most controversial things are debated. And we actually had to update our regulations and our board bylaws to allow that meeting to be remote and have a remote voting and remote debate. And that was a very interesting challenge, considering our entire conference and expo had been canceled for 2 straight years. So that is a challenge. It's still following the rules. And ANSI, from NFPA standpoint, ANSI has been amazing at this, where we've been able to call and say to the EXSC and to ANSI staff, okay, what do we do with this situation? And going back to the tenets of the essential requirements of what's really the goal you're trying to accomplish, and how do you have integrity in that, knowing that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So ANSI staff has been great for that. So I would say if you're feeling a challenge there around that, please reach out to ANSI directly. Someone is asking, I saw a note from my friend Michelle about it, whether in-person meetings would be required in the future. I'm going to assume that, does that mean that we're going to have to do them? I'm not sure. I think that's going to come down to, I think Amanda had a great line. It depends on not only the organization, it'll depend on the culture of your committees. Again, some committees, I'm sure, won't go back to face-to-face meetings. They enjoy these meetings. They enjoy saving in the travel. The culture of that committee is one way. Other committees, as Dan said, are chomping at the bit to get back together. There's a culture there where a lot gets decided there. Oh, wait. Good old Mary McKeel's got her hand up. So I'm going to call on Mary and see what she has for a question. Mary?
What do you mean old?
Well, good faithful Mary McKeel. Faithful. Thank you. That's a better word.
You can't get out of this.
Oh, you're killing me. You're killing me, Mary.
This has just been great. Thank you so much to Chris, to Dan, to Amanda, and Stephanie. This has been very, very useful. And I was just going to perhaps try to suggest that this group periodically return to this subject, because everybody is in the process of learning, and we will all continue to do so. And you've had such good tips and experiences to share. I'd like to just suggest that we return to this whenever your chair feels like we could do that. Thank you all very much.
Great. Thanks, Mary. That's really helpful. I would encourage you all to share your feedback with ANSI. And any surveys or any responses that ANSI sends out, please not only talk about how this session went, but more importantly, put down challenges you're still facing or questions that you'd like to see answered. because the leadership of the OMF and ANSI staff are going to be looking at what type of sessions do we hold in the future? What type of events do we hold? How do we have these, whether they're in person? Do we, for example, one of the things that I keep throwing out there is a crazy idea is, do we do one of these sessions in a hybrid mode and kind of test it real time and practice with each other and have votes and do all that stuff? And just because it give me an excuse to actually be on the in-person side, because I'm one of the people chomping at the bit to be in person again. So with that, I want to thank all the presenters. Thank you again for a great job on the Q&As. I want to thank everybody who participated in the chat. It was a great challenge, and I prefer that challenge over nobody putting stuff in the chat. So thank you very much for that. And with that, I believe I'm turning it back over to Ed. Ed?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You actually did have a couple of minutes left, but this is great because we're pretty much on schedule. That was wonderful. And I see that Mary finally put her hand down. That's good. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I would like to see if you have a few words you want to wrap up with, Chris. You've done essentially that in the last couple of minutes, but any last words before you disappear here?
No, I just want, I'll say yes. I said no, but I'll say yes. I want to go back to remind a lot of the SDOs that are, seeing this huge challenge that we're all facing. And I'm sure you and your organization have worked through a process or a way to get your standards done. And I want to encourage you to keep following that until you can get these things down. Some of us, the large SDOs, are faced with different challenges and different sizes of groups and things like that. But if you found that system that works for you in the meantime, I would encourage you to stick with that and be confident and learn along with all of us as we go through. So that's how I'll end it. Ed, thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And you alluded earlier to, you'll probably disappear from the screen and Sarah will come up, but you alluded to earlier that we'll have some follow-on sessions and so forth. We've been talking, the task force that we've been working on these meetings are considering having some follow-up, maybe shorter web conferences dealing with more details on a particular subject item other than just the logistics. We were tossing around a few ideas and the possibilities. So, for example, how do you make a meeting more effective with remote participation with the face-to-face and the face-to-face with the remote? And there are ways of dealing with that. Something that came up here and I see starting to come up on these browsers is the use of breakout rooms. And I can see if that perfects just a little bit more, or we get a little more into it, maybe it already does it. But I could see a couple of people leaving the main meeting, going immediately to the breakout room. If somebody's face-to-face, they can just go into the online version and get into the room with somebody else who's coming into it online and have a breakout session that's a private breakout session. I also would like to see that's face-to-face in some of these meetings. If a couple of the members in the meeting, instead of whispering and disrupting the meeting about some issue or something, and they would usually be expected to step outside the physical room, maybe we have easy access to a large phone booth of sorts where they can actually remotely get out of the meeting and have a chat and maybe even see each other visually or what have you. But I think the breakout feature will be something that will help facilitate some of these things that we like to handle on the side too. So we're going to be sending out a survey and trying to get your ideas for, what you would like to see next. I mean, is it things like the staff functions? Do you want to know about helpful hints and miscellaneous things that help to make the thing better, give you some ideas, talk about the features on a particular browser and maybe have, breakouts for different types of browsers occasionally, something along those lines. We, in addition to those, which will be a series that we're thinking about, and we'll be asking if you think it's a good idea. The future meetings in spring of 2022 is still to be determined, I think, unless Michelle has any more detail on that, but it'll probably be online. But in the fall of 2022, we'll have a face-to-face in conjunction with the World Standards Week then, and hopefully we'll have a World Standards Day celebration and all of that face-to-face. So that will be October 11th to 14th in 2022.